Hello, everybody, and welcome to this panel discussion hosted by the Institute for Holocaust, Genocide, and Memory Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst and co-sponsored by the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies. I'm David Mednikoff. I serve as chair of the Department of Judaic and Near Eastern Studies at UMass, which is the home department of Professor Olga Gershenson, whose new book is the subject of today's discussion. I am delighted to be here to listen to perspectives on my dear colleague's wonderful new book. I have also recently been asked to serve together with Professor John Olson in the Department of History as interim co-director of this institute while our director, Professor Alon Confino, is on leave. I want to take this occasion to say that while we all eagerly await for Alon to come back to the institute, John and I will do what we can to continue the very important, innovative, insightful, and interdisciplinary programming and other activities that the Institute has become well known for during Alon's visionary leadership. I encourage those of you with ties to the Institute to share with me and Professor Olson your ideas about how we might further the Institute's work. Thanks so much for your help and understanding. And now let me introduce today's moderator, Dr. Rachel S. Harris. Dr. Harris holds the Gimelstopp Eminent Scholar Chair for Judaic Studies and is a professor of film and multimedia studies at Florida Atlantic University, where she also directs the program in Jewish Studies. Dr. Harris, take it away.
Thank you so much, David, for that lovely introduction. I am your host for this evening's proceedings, or this afternoon, but I have a little gloomy storm going on in the background. It seems very appropriate for setting the scene for an evening of horror films. I'd like to welcome everyone to this exciting celebration of Olga's book, New Israeli Horror, Local Cinema, Global Genre. I've had the wonderfully good fortune of being on the sidelines watching as this book developed. What has been most remarkable for me about this project, as someone who is much too scared to watch horror films, has been how fascinating her study of the genre's rise in Israeli society has been, and the incredible research and untold numbers of interviews that she conducted with the genre's founders and the executors. What the filmmakers reveal is a deep and profound passion for genre filmmaking, but also for taking this global genre and translating it through a local lens. Despite its title and subject matter, this has always been about more than just horror films. It has been about how a group of enthusiasts and pioneers can take a dream and by sharing it, make it a public sensation. Today's speakers come to this virtual table to explore the many different areas that the book touches on. Melissa Weininger will speak to the way the book has been informative for engaging with Israeli film in her classroom. Jeremy Dauber will be speaking about the aspects of horror film and Israel's place in the global genre. And Pablo Utin, who is a member of the first fan club at Tel Aviv University that is documented in the book, will be speaking about how we can consider the representation of horror after October the 7th. I'll introduce each speaker, and at the end we will have time for questions, so you can send those to me in the chat. But I am pleased to start today by introducing Olga Gershenson, who will be speaking about the book and sharing some film clips and examples. Professor Gershenson is an accomplished scholar based in Judaic and Near Eastern Studies and also film studies at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst. She's the author of several books. Her first book, Gesher, Russian Theater in Israel, pioneered the study of Russian immigrant cultural production, which was followed by several articles that have made her the premier scholar of Russian-Israeli cinema. She's also the author of The Phantom Holocaust, which reveals unknown Holocaust films from the Soviet Union. Her inordinate ability to identify new topics of scholarship, which has led to her founding several new fields, means that I cannot pass without mentioning her collection, Ladies and Gents, Public Toilets and Gender, whose universal appeal established the field of toilet studies. Certainly, today's book is likely to have no less an impact. And with that introduction, I invite Professor Gershenson to share her presentation.
Well, thank you, Rachel, for very generous introduction. Let me see that the technology agrees with me today. So you guys will let me know. If not, I will ask my panelists. Guys, can you see
Yes, we see our presentation, but we also
wonderful.
see.
And now you can see okay, great. So thank you all for being here. So let me first situate the project for you. Until 2010, there were practically no Israeli horror films whatsoever. And since 2010, enough of them were made for me to write this book. So clearly something happened, right? So the first question then is, what happened with the horror in Israeli culture, right? Like, why horror and why now? Before 2010, Israeli cinema traditionally had a very uneasy relationship with not just horror, but the very idea of popular entertainment genres in general. So that's the first question, why horror and why not? And then the second question is, what do these films bring to the table as horror films, as an Israeli films? And my book answers this question, and now I'm just gonna give you a little bit of a taste. So I will first speak to the first question, why horror and why now? So I want to start with understanding of the social scene in which this new cycle of film emerged. The filmmakers of New Israeli horror belong to the same millennial generation. Theirs was the first Israeli generation to grow up in an era of home video and cable, which gave them access to international genre film and television, especially American action, sci-fi, and horror. These films were an important influence on them. By the way, as this picture of a manor shows, most of them are men. All of them are Ashkenazi or European descent, with very few Mizrahim or Jews from Muslim lands, and no Palestinian citizens of Israel whatsoever. The core of these filmmakers came from Tel Aviv University Film School. And what influenced them more than the formal curriculum was actually Homoratech Film Club, where the students watched genre films, which their professors would never show in class. And today we have among the panelists, Pablo Utin, who was one of the founders of that Homoratech. The club was unofficial and unsanctioned, with films pirated online and screening advertised by DIY flyers like the one you see here. So these screenings validated students' love for so-called low genres and created a community. What more, these students started working together and sharing their work at Homoratech for feedback. Another social institution that was really important for the development of New Israeli horror was Utopia, which is a sci-fi, fantasy, and horror film festival in Tel Aviv, in and out of itself, a very new festival, which in 2006 introduced for the first time a program of Israeli genre films, and there were only 5 altogether. They were just like non-existent. But throughout 2010, every festival, it is an annual festival, featured at least 3-4 Israeli features, some of them horror, dozens of short films, discussions with filmmakers, awards, workshops, even programs for children that generated or cultivated the new generation of horror fans. Another aspect that I want to talk about in terms of emergence of that new cycle of films is film funding. As you know, in production, film production is really, really expensive. And what helped these young filmmakers is that in 2000s, there was a change in technology. With digital cameras, the shooting became much cheaper, so that you could produce a film on a shoestring budget. And instead of waiting for public funding, which is really hard to get in Israel, you can cobble something together from your own funds, from some small grants, and just shoot. And of course, if you're shooting on a shoestring budget, that means that your production is guerrilla style, meaning that everyone or many people, cast, crew, work for free, families provide catering and sometimes emotional support. And even working in this style, it is still expensive, it is still complicated, and it takes a long time to make a movie. So from my point of view, every filmmaker of the new Israeli horror is a hero. The final factor that I want to point out that defined this cycle is a change in film market. So along with production during 2010, the media environment has changed. National ticket sales no longer matter as much. Horror films turn to genre fans beyond Israel. Like other international horror films, they can go into worldwide straight to digital release and not necessarily wait for success or lack of success at home. And Israeli horror films indeed entered new markets and now circulate through new channels of distribution. Instead of Cannes or Venice, prestigious film festival, they go to like new for Israeli filmmakers international horror, sci-fi, and fantasy festivals like Cibius in Spain or Fantaspoint in Brazil. So to answer the question I posed earlier, why horror and why now? The answer lies in a combination of factors. The social thing, new modes of funding and production, and new media environment. Now, let me turn to my second question. What do these films bring to the table? What is their innovation as horror films and as Israeli films? The horror figures, like zombies or ghosts that appear in this movie are not novel in and out of themselves. What was novel was the way in which they landed in the local Israeli reality and created a kind of combination of global and local. So I show how this, in the book, I show how these new Israeli horror films combine global local tropes, such as, character types or particular narratives or stories, some formal characteristics, and local cultural signifiers like recognizable Israeli institutions and realities that we would normally identify within Israeli film. And there are different ways in which these two combine. And now I'm going to give you some examples of different combinations of this global and local in new Israeli horror. The very first film of the Israeli horror cycle, and also I think one of the best, is Rabies from 2010. And its filmmakers, Gershenson and Papusha, do something unexpected. They reimagine how the horror tropes change or even go wrong in the encounter with Israeli sensibilities. So let's see the trailer. As you watch, pay attention what looks familiar from other horror movies, especially if you're a horror fan, and maybe from other Israeli films, if you are familiar with that. So it's a short, it's just a trailer, just to refresh our memory in case we did see the film. And if it's a little choppy, then it's, it's on Zoom.
לא להתרחק. הוא בא!
אתם בטוחים שאת הדרך?
כן. או?
הוא בא!
תקשיבו, אם תוך 10 דקות היער הזה לא מתחלף לבניינים, אני חוזר.
מפקד, כאן 320 שומע.
תגיעו בדחיפות לשמורת השועלים.
היא לא סגורה?
So the film opens with a familiar premise that I'm sure you identify, right? A group of young people is lost in the woods. A serial killer is on the prowl. This is familiar to us from numerous classic slasher films, such as Halloween, or Friday the 13th, Cabin Fever. But unlike these films, Rabies is a deconstruction of a slasher. It starts with these familiar tropes, but when it plants them on the Israeli soil, they kind of fall apart. So let's take a case of a serial killer. Historically, there have not been many high-profile serial killers in Israel or movies about them. So the filmmakers asked, what would a serial killer look like in Israel? And they imagined that an Israeli serial killer would be based on a local stereotype. Here, the killer would be a shlemiel, like the guy who comes to fix your plumbing, doesn't know what he's doing, never finishes the job. So in Rabies, unlike in a classic slasher, the killer is incompetent, and he actually sleeps through the entire plot. So sorry about that spoiler if you haven't seen it, but it doesn't matter. Even without him, the violence continues as if on its own, and in the end, almost everyone is dead. So it is an Israeli society, in the logic of this film, that turns violence against itself, which is, ever since Rabies, becomes a recurring motif in Israeli horror. But the most common thing for Israeli horror is not necessarily to, take this global tropes and break them into pieces by landing them in Israel, but rather just to take a horror trope and transplant them to Israeli setting, and then kind of create this sort of hybrid. The Israeli setting could be something very familiar, like a kibbutz, or the IDF, and of course the IDF is the most common. But I want to talk here about Jerusalem with a Z that draws on global tropes of zombie apocalypse, but lands them in the old city of Jerusalem, of course, a symbolic location for Judaism, and even references the Hebrew Bible, the Talmud. So let us again see a trailer and just also pay attention. What do you recognize? What looks familiar from horror films and or Israeli films?
Oh my God, I can't believe we're really going.
What's our seat number again?
How's he doing?
What?
We've now reached our destination.
Welcome to Jerusalem.
A church next to a synagogue, next to a temple, all stuck together.
Look where we are. It's insane. The city is awesome.
If you don't believe in God, you came to the wrong city.
Yom Kippur, Judgment Day. It's not the skies that's opening up tonight. It's the ground.
It's religious bullshit.
They're closing the gates. They're not letting anybody out of the city. Come on, come on!
So, as you probably have gathered from that trailer, a tourist trip turns into biblical catastrophe in this film, and our protagonists find themselves in the midst of this kind of resurrection of the dead, where the dead become flying zombies. So lots of it actually looks familiar, right? Two films that were particularly influential are Spanish Wreck and The American Cloverfield. Like these two films, Jerusalem is using a found footage trope to depict a societal collapse. But the influence of these two films extends way beyond that. Like in Wreck, quarantine stands for betrayal by authorities, only instead of an isolated building like in Wreck, in Jerusalem, the entire old city is on military lockout. Even the monsters that populate Jerusalem are similar to Wreck, like the first kind of monster is, the resurrected dead, resurrection being one of the tenets of Judaism, and they look a little bit even like monsters in Wreck. Now, it's significant that in Wreck, the monster is rooted in kind of Catholic repression, whereas in Jerusalem, the resurrection starts because of political violence in contemporary Israel-Palestine. In the words of the film, there is so much hatred, it runs deep into the ground, waking up the dead. The second kind of monster that we meet in Jerusalem is a Godzilla-like giant who looks a little bit like a figure in Cloverfield, like who knows what those are. But in Jerusalem, they are called the Nephilim, like the biblical Nephilim, but with a lot more modest CGI. So, what do all these global tropes mean once they're localized to the city of Jerusalem? The invasion of the undead in Jerusalem is not a punishment for traditional sins like promiscuity or blasphemy. In the moral universe of the film, it is the Israeli-Palestinian strife that precipitates the apocalypse. By the end of the film, again, sorry about spoiling, the evil that originates in the old city cannot be contained, and it spreads from the city when the swarms of zombies fly out of Jerusalem, which is this screenshot. So here, like in other new Israeli horror films, the monsters come from within Israel, from within Judaism, from the heart of Jerusalem, the most sacred place for Jews and Jewish history. So if this sounds to us like political critique, that was not the filmmakers' intention at all. They set their sight on making a fun horror film that would appeal to a global audience, and they relied on Jewish mythology and Jerusalem setting to give their film local character, not to make a statement. However, as they were adapting the horror tropes changed their film and created political commentary. So far, I talked about two films that combine the global tropes and the local Israeli reality, right, in different ways. But some new Israeli horror films want to focus on universal and avoid the local setting as much as possible. Interestingly, it turns out that it is very difficult to avoid the local or the national character. This is the case with a wonderful film, Madame Yankilova's Fine Literature Club. Let's see the trailer. So as I hope it was clear from this clip, the setting is not really Israel. It's some kind of alternate reality, even though if you hear the dialogue in this film, the dialogue is in Hebrew. But beyond the language, there are no recognizable Israeli signifiers. In terms of style, it's a Gothic fairy tale, and it draws on the fantasy worlds of Tim Burton and Jean-Pierre Jeunet. And yet, as alien as this aesthetic is to Israel, in the local context, it's hard to ignore meanings that arise from it. Madame Yankilova is a story of female cannibals, led by a police chief whose goal is to consume the best male specimen and to grind them into small phallic objects. As fantastical as this film is, its idea circles back to the critical messages about the army and the state that is so common in Israeli horror. So I'm gonna stop here, and I will give stage to our wonderful panelists.
So thank you so much, Olga, and thank you for sharing those clips. They're really evocative, and they sort of really give us a sense of the kind of the wide range of horror films that you're discussing here. So our next speaker is Dr. Melissa Weininger, who's Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies at California State University in Northridge. Her research focuses on Hebrew and Yiddish literature with an emphasis on contemporary Israeli literature. Her other research interests include gender, nationalism, and popular culture, with a particular interest in Israeli television. Her book, Beyond the Land, Diaspora, Israeli Culture in the 21st Century, examines the meanings and uses of diaspora in contemporary literature and art. With Shana Weiss, she also writes a newsletter on Israeli pop culture called It's No Ibiza. Her article about the Israeli sketch comedy show Hayudim Bayim recently appeared in the journal Studies in American Jewish Literature.
To remember to unmute myself. Thanks, and I want to thank Olga for inviting me to be on this panel and everyone who organized it. This is just really fun and interesting, so thank you. I want to focus not on the title of Olga's book, New Israeli Horror, but on the subtitle and what it says about the significance of the book, not just to the fields it represents, film studies, Israel studies, Jewish studies, but also to those of us who will use it in our research and our teaching. The subtitle of the book, Local Cinema, Global Genre, is a hint toward the ways that this work straddles the boundaries of various fields and the way the book might be productive for those of us trying to bridge those gaps in our own work. In what follows, I want to give a couple of examples from my own interests and my current work and the way I'm using the book to illustrate the importance and utility of New Israeli horror, especially at this pivotal moment in the history of Israel and the future of Israel studies. There's an increasing appetite for horror in popular culture, as Olga noted in her presentation, not just in Israel, but globally. According to Nielsen, as of October 2023, the horror films released that year had already generated more revenue than films in the genre had earned in all of 2022. The entry of horror films like those of Jordan Peele and Bong Joon-ho into Oscar contention is also evidence of its increasing inclusion even in ostensibly high cultural spaces. New Israeli horror provides us with a vocabulary for understanding Israeli horror, the local cinema of the title, against the backdrop of this international and transcultural genre phenomenon, the global genre of the title. Not only does it chart a new genre in Israel and offer a critical vocabulary for understanding it, but New Israeli horror also places the Israeli horror genre within this broader historical international context, one which, given horror's increasing popularity, is of great importance. While New Israeli Horror is focused on the nascent history of horror films in Israel, it also comes at an important moment in the evolution of horror culture in Israel. It was only a few years ago, in 2017, that the first Israeli horror TV show, the vampire series Judah, debuted on the Hot Network, and that it's available to stream on Hulu. For those of you who haven't seen it, highly recommend watching. And in 2021, another horror TV show, Malach Mashchit, or Angel of Death, appeared on the Israeli public broadcasting network, Kan. While Olga's book charts the appearance and development of an essentially new genre in Israeli film, the appearance of these recent TV shows demonstrates that the phenomenon and categories that she identifies in New Israeli horror are not just important and real, but growing and have broader implications than even the book itself claims. As Yaron Peleg has noted, television is often the best way to document cultural trends because of the relatively quicker production schedule, the necessity to respond to popular trends to keep viewership, especially in the age of streaming, and the closeness of television to viewers, both literally and figuratively. The appearance of these TV shows, then, is an excellent demonstration of how the theses of this book interact with other documented trends within current scholarship on Israeli culture. Both of these shows maintain specific Israeli cultural characteristics and locations, and include Jewish folkloristic or religious manifestations of the horror genre, whether real or fictional. And as I'll show in a minute, work in a slightly different way than some of the films that Olga just introduced. Judah creates an elaborate imaginary tradition of Jewish vampire folklore that is linked to real Jewish religious and folk traditions. And Malach Mashchit draws on Kabbalah and demonology drawn from Jewish tradition. Both also link their horrific elements to Ashkenazi diasporic history. At the same time, like many of the films in the book, both Judah and Malach Mashchit are highly localized in an Israeli context, culturally, socially, and geographically. According to my own reading of the categorization offered in New Israeli Horror, these shows are somewhat unique in that they fall, I think, into the category of inversion, which none of the films under consideration in the book do. Indeed, Olga claims that Israeli filmmakers have not yet created a horror film that both uses local culture signifiers and rejects global horror tropes in favor of its own highly localized brand of horror. But not only do these shows deeply embed their stories within the local Israeli context, they also invent or adapt the monsters at the heart of their horror plots from unique figures drawn from Jewish tradition or placed artificially into them, in the case of Judah's Jewish vampire, rather than rely solely on recognizably horrific monsters, on the kind of global horror tropes that Olga pointed out. Judah's vampire is not the vampire of European folklore, but precedes it. And the demon in Malach Mashchit is not the malevolent spirit of ghost stories and tales of exorcism, but an ancient Jewish demon unleashed. Indeed, the horror elements of these shows seem to suggest that Jewish horror is the original horror, and everything that comes after is actually derivative of it. This is just one example of the way that the flexible model that Olga has invented here is endlessly adaptable to an emerging genre and an emerging field of study. The ability to understand these shows, not just in terms of religious representation in Israeli culture, but also in terms of their unique genre, is one of the benefits of the hybrid model of local cinema, global genre offered by the book. The growing production of Israeli horror, its expansion into other cultural realms, and its flexibility in combining with other existing theories guarantees the book's relevance to scholars. I've already used it in my own work. I'm using it right now in my writing about these television shows. And the clear organization and straightforward prose of the book, I think, also make it really useful for the classroom. And while I haven't added horror to my Jewish film class yet, I'm sure that day is coming as it becomes an ever more relevant genre, as well as one that most students are conversant with and enjoy. And perhaps most importantly, New Israeli Horror provides a simple and elegant rubric for categorizing and thinking about the work that Israeli horror does, specifically with regard to the Zionist Israeli cultural imaginary, as well as the tropes of the horror genre in general, and in thinking about how those things intersect and interact with each other. This method for thinking about the intersecting modes of representation involved in Israeli horror is particularly important now when we see real-life horrors unfolding in the news with backdrops not unlike those in the films under consideration in the book, even if the details are very different. So far, at least as far as I know, no zombies have appeared in Jerusalem. One of the recurring ideas in New Israeli horror is the way that Israeli horror develops a new mode of thematizing violence in Israeli cinema. That is, the violence occurs outside the context of national struggle or war. And while many of the filmmakers, as well as the public, tend to characterize Israeli horror films as apolitical, or even as an alternative to standard Zionist politics, the book makes the argument that these films often are political, or at least have political elements, whether implicit or explicit. In the changed political climate after October 7th, it seems clear that the horror genre could be representationally more important than ever before to a society in need of ways to represent and grapple with violence that falls outside of historically recognizable forms.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Our next speaker is Jeremy Dauber, who is a professor of Jewish literature and American studies at Columbia University. His most recent book is a biography of Mel Brooks, and his next book in bookstores in time for Halloween is a history of American horror called American Scary.
Well, thank you, Rachel, and Olga, thank you so much for letting me be a part of this, for inviting me. It is really a wonderful opportunity to be with some old friends and to talk about just this wonderful book that you've written. You know, it is just so thorough and comprehensive about this incredibly exciting moment in Israeli cinema. It somehow manages, I don't know how you managed to do this, but it somehow manages to combine, you know, theoretical sophistication with full cultural criticism, with sort of a mindset to the kind of actual production. It feels like you actually know what it means to make a film. Putting all of these things together, all of these different approaches, and balancing them so eruditely and so lightly is really not an easy feat, and it is just carried off tremendously well. So a mazel tov to you on the book, and it's just so great to be a part of this and to get a chance to think about it with everyone here. So I am not, unlike Melissa, who just did such a wonderful job also presenting the book, I'm not an expert on Israeli cinema. I'm not an expert on Israeli cinema or Israeli literature, but I have, like Rachel, but I have watched a lot of horror movies. I've watched a lot of them, particularly for this book, a lot of American horror movies over the course of the last couple of years. And so have you, as you can tell from all of the different parallels and resonances that you note sort of very frequently on thematic, on visual levels, you know, constantly sort of informing the book and informing our understanding of what some of the Israeli filmmakers are thinking about as they go into making their different works. And so basically, because, you know, you guys have done such a good job covering the ground already, I just wanted to focus on two particular aspects of horror movies in general, and maybe sort of the position of these horror movie makers that really came out to me as I was reading the book and were so interesting to me. The first was, and this was something that Melissa sort of talked about towards the end of her presentation, but I'm going to do it in a different way, is this question of politics. And I think, you know, in the book, you make a very powerful doubled point, as Melissa had said, that some of these filmmakers are presenting a kind of ostensibly apolitical stance. But in reality, that these movies are saturated with sort of political thought, and not surprisingly, given your approach to the book and the approach to the book really focuses on that political aspect in the nature of, not surprisingly, what's going on in Israeli politics. As I've been writing my own book on American horror, a different kind of political axis has been sort of running around my head, thinking very much about sort of the nature of the horror movie itself. And in my teaching in horror, I'm teaching a class on the history of American horror. I think about this a lot with a colleague of mine, and we have slightly different approaches, so it's been fun. And that is a political spectrum of what I would call conservatism versus radicalism in the horror film more generally. And here I don't mean this as representing a particular political position, and certainly not a political position on specific geopolitical questions or national questions or anything like that, right? But a question simply of whether or not a view of the universe that's articulated in a particular horror film is conservative or radical. In the sense of, and this was getting mostly to your point about sort of Jewish values being sort of underneath at the very beginning, whether or not ultimately we come from a position of the monster or the horror being sort of a chaotic, sort of let loose in the world, and coming ultimately to a cathartic ending in which certain internal verities are observed, a kind of conservative approach in that respect, which is characteristic of a lot of different horror movies, ranging from some of the monster classics to Halloween in their own ways. Even if the punishment that comes for the crime or the aberration is disproportionate, there's still a kind of conservatism there. Or, as sort of many of the movies that come out of the 1970s, a kind of, in America, a kind of radicalism, right, that suggests that ultimately these kind of structures of catharsis really fail to obtain based on a metaphysical view of the universe that really is ultimately meaningless or absurdist in a certain kind of way. And that, it seems to me that very frequently in the horror movies, we see there's really a tension here, and it's a tension that also plays itself out in the way that horror movies are made to sort of leave the audience feeling something, right? That comes out very powerfully in a lot of the movies that you're talking about as well, right? Sometimes they interact with national narratives, sometimes they don't. But that kind of conservatism or radicalism really becomes built in some ways to an essential kind of metaphysical question that every horror movie and every work of horror needs to answer about where it wants to leave its audience vis-a-vis their place in the universe. I think what's interesting, apropos Melissa's, and I have to confess I did not think about this while I was reading the book, Melissa's insight, right, is in some ways how this fits into kind of questions of Jewish theology that again are baked in, like it or not, in some ways, to a kind of Israeli endeavor in a horror film, just as I think you argue quite plausibly, many of the national myths of the Zionist state are built in, whether they're subversive or they're conversive or what have you. So that was the first kind of track that your book and all this conversation sort of was set my mind on. The second was, I started my days, as Rachel knows, as you guys know, as a literary critic, let's say. And one of the things that, we learned back in the day was this theory of minor literatures. And this idea of, put it sort of simply, right, we have to read them and they don't have to read us. The question that kept coming up as I was reading sort of this work and going back to the influences that you limn so wonderfully in the book is, what does that mean in general when it comes to a horror movie? Right. Because in some sense, here we have a group of amazing filmmakers who are really saturated with saying this is the product of all of these global, not just global, but these sort of hegemonic places out there that really, yes, we'll take, they really are the ones that we need to kind of deal with and think through in terms of making our movie. But on the other hand, horror directors, all directors in some ways, but horror directors are particularly magpies. If there is a useful effect that will make a universal jump scare, we're going to take it from wherever it is it comes, and we don't really care about that. And one of the things that you do so nicely is certainly articulate the suggestion, even if it hasn't been carried out, that could go both ways, right? American horror directors are perfectly happy to find some technique from somewhere else, right? And so the idea that now we have a J horror and a K horror and hopefully an I horror, as you put it at the end, that is the sort of, so is there, when it comes to genres that are all playing in the same convention, do these kind of theories of major and minor really work in the same way that they do with sort of novelistic literature? Because, in certain ways, we can think of horror as not, the horror movie, I think particularly, as not just a series of stories, but a series of technical concepts and developments that can then be used effectively by a variety of filmmakers. One of the things that I thought was the most powerful observation that you made, that even I haven't seen as many of these movies, but that came to, was this idea of daylight horror, right? And how important that is as sort of an Israeli proof of concept of what it means to be an Israeli horror movie. But it's also a proof of concept that you can make a good horror movie by daylight. And this was, for example, in the horror fiction of the 1980s, it was a gauntlet that was thrown down by the British writer Ramsey Campbell, a neo-Lovecraftian of the early 80s. If you're a fan of horror fiction, you know, it just says, you know, he has a book called Demons by Daylight. And this was the equivalent of that. And you say, well, let's throw down the gauntlet, and maybe there'll be a spate of other horror filmmakers who will maybe not even allude to these Israeli movies in the kind of nods and winks that we talk about, but just say, here are these proofs of concept that become really important, these technical developments. And so that, again, kind of throws that theory of minor literature into a cocked hat, because it just says, you know, it's all about just who can do it best. On this sort of very grounded level. So, you know, these were just two of the many different sort of insights that came out, but they are just generated by just how many sparks you're throwing off in this book. So thank you for the opportunity to read it and to talk about it with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jeremy. And it's really helpful to have your insight here on like seeing Israeli horror in the larger context of this conversation. So our final speaker today is Dr. Utin, who was born in Buenos Aires in Argentina in 1976. He immigrated to Israel in 1996, and he's the author of the book Ankot, the New Israeli Cinema, Conversations with Filmmakers. Sorry, I have a weird typo on my notes. The New Israeli Cinema, and I have the book in front of me, which is even sillier. Lessons in Israeli Cinema, the New Israeli Cinema 2009 to 2015, a Requiem for Peace, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Israeli cinema after the Al-Aqsa Intifada, and forthcoming From Charlie to Shuli, Popular Cinema and the Invention of Israeli Identity. He teaches at the Steve Tisch School of Film and Television at Tel Aviv University, Beit Bell School of Arts and Shenkar College. He's also a film critic for Haaretz and the chairperson of the Israeli Film Critics Association. Take it away.
Hi.
Take it away. Unmute, Pablo.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Okay, so I'm here also particularly to not in a mixed hat from one side as an academic or film critic, but on the other side as part of the book of this sorry, I will start. Of this phenomenon of the Israeli horror genre and how it started, because as Olga writes in her book, she doesn't only write about make theory and analysis and global and all the influences. She is also very concerned about how this phenomenon actually came into existence. She interviews directors and people who are part of this phenomenon to understand where it all started. And as she showed in her presentation, it started as a kind of underground movement that I was part of at the university, Tel Aviv University. We created, me and three friends, one of them, Aaron Keshales, who will become one of the filmmakers, main central filmmakers of this wave of horror films. And we created a kind of film club for horror and zombies and samurai films and all that stuff, the Hamorotech. And I think it's not just like an historical thing, but it's more of a conceptual thing, because when we see these horror films, this wave of horror films that Olga talks about, they're all horror films that are subversive and come as a way of resistance against the mainstream of Israeli cinema. Most of the Israeli cinema are war conflict films or family films. Most of them are family actual films, dramas, family dramas. And this idea of making horror is not supported at that time by film funds or by mainstream media. And I think what Melissa talked about and also Olga talked a bit, what is happening now is kind of horror. It's losing its subvertive or resistant, its marginal stance, its marginal place in Israeli cinema. They're not making anymore, like the wave kind of ended of horror films, and it went into TV series and TV shows that you are watching. But these TV shows don't come from a kind of subversive trying to not, but are part of the mainstream production. They have more support, more budget, and in a sense they're losing this kind of do-it-yourself, that wasn't only on the film club but was in the films themselves, this kind of do-it-yourself concept that I'm going to make these horror films against all odds and all that stuff. Now it became institutionalized. Even in the universities and film schools, they're teaching genre workshops, so students can learn how to do the course. And so it's also losing this kind of I'm doing it by myself, learning, self-educating myself in genre and how to make it work. So in a sense, it's a beautiful thing that is happening, but in another sense, it's kind of taking out this kind of anti-institutionalized way of horror cinema in Israel. When I think about so all this kind of thing comes in the context of when we put it in the context of the October 7th, we start to see that I must confess, it's too early to say anything about horror films after October 7th. But what is happening now is that a lot of films are starting to be made, a lot of projects are in production in order to tell stories about not only documentaries, also fiction. I know that Danny Rosenberg and Tom Shuval are working like in an omnibus film with the short stories about the October 7th. And I have two things to say about this. The first thing is that this wave of horror cinema that Olga talks about in the book, it's not a reaction to something that happened in the past, but I think it's more kind of a prophetic cinema. When we see it today, we see, okay, these filmmakers were feeling something unconsciously. They were watching the Israeli society going to very, very dark and violent places. They couldn't put it in words, in the sense, they couldn't scream it straightforward, so they put it as images, as a sensation, as a horror sensation that look what is happening. Also, the horror in these films, as Olga mentions in the book, it's coming from within. The IDF is the horror. The Israeli society are the monsters. It's not like the monsters are coming from outside. After October 7th, suddenly the monsters are also coming from outside, and I don't know if it will make a more interesting cinema in that sense. Because if you're kind of reacting to something and trying to make a stance about something that you're reacting to it, instead of kind of feeling the sensation and put it into images, so it will become among mainstream cinema if horror films are made. But so I don't know if horror films will be made about this, because it comes from a more subversive place that today in Israeli society is missing. But I'm totally sure that these films that are making today about October 7th will use, like films before, like Before or Lebanon, or films that were war films or military films, they will use horror styles and horror motives and incorporate them into their creations. So the filmmakers will not make, I think, proper horror films, but they will use horror tropes for their films. So in a way, there will be horror films, but we are going to call them realism. And I think that's the biggest thing. So it's not good for horror cinema in that sense, but it's an interesting way to communicate with horror, and it will be interesting to see how this happens. For a lot of experiences of people surviving in close places, in the miklatin, in the refugees, in their houses, and being attacked in the houses. So this idea is a very stressful. It's part of a horror genre, in the sense that horror genre has a lot of, like, the house that is being attacked by strangers. So it's a genre. or let's say maybe rape revenge or a lot of tropes of horror cinema, but they won't be, I think, horror films per se. And this is very interesting in that sense. They will use these tropes, but they will be more realistic horror. But you know, to say more than this, it's to exaggerate because it's too early to know what will happen. I don't know if I have more time or, but this is kind of the way of integrate styles. Maybe you can open.
Thank you, Pablo, so much for reflecting on this. And I think that what you're speaking to is sort of how do you make something subversive, something radical, when the reality is just so much worse than you could have possibly speculated, and it becomes documentary and not horror and not fiction. You know, it's no longer fun.
Also, there is very little room for criticism now in Israel. We are so traumatized that we cannot find the words to speak out in a critical way yet. There is a very small space for that, and so yes, I think that horror, even if there, as Olga pointed out, even if the filmmakers are not making it consciously, they are very, very critical because they are showing the horrors of a society, the worst parts, the most violent and you know terrible parts of a society. And when these films were being made in 10 years ago, so we were feeling that the country is going to that place, to those places. But now that we are there, it's not like you can make again about. They were kind of a warning sign in a sense, these horror films. And when I talked with the filmmakers, they sometimes they feel like that. They say, "Well, we talked about it. We told everybody if people would just watch Kalevet, you know, rabbits or Big Bad Wolves or other films, they would have noticed that we were talking about how we justify violence from within because all this stuff is happening to protect our children or because we are angry on our friends." But today is kind of what are we going to do? It's like a more of a reaction to what happened. And I'm not sure Israel is very fond of horror cinema through the history. We weren't fond of horror cinema to express the trauma.
Right.
People didn't go to that genre.
So we have a few minutes for questions. And so I invite the audience to send questions in the chat if you have any. Olga, do you want to respond to any of the things that were said on the panel today?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So first of all, I really enjoyed listening to your presentations. So thank you so much. It's so different. I will start, I'll go probably in reverse order. So I think that I profoundly agree with Pablo that these new Israeli films were in a way prophecies. You know, that's the idea from Siegfried Krakauer's famous book about the films of German expressionism kind of previsaging the rise of the German fascism. So I think that these films really captured that kind of rise of societal violence and ultimate its complete and utter outbreak. And I think that another point that Pablo made about kind of realistic films absorbing horror tropes and using them in very productive ways is already happening. I was thinking about it when I was watching film Golda, that is ostensibly, you know, a film about Golda Meir. And the particular moment in 1973 war. But it is in many ways a horror film that really relies on horror tropes. So another point that I found really resonant was Melissa's treatment of Judah and the benevolent bride. For some reason, they translated Malach Mashchit as benevolent bride.
Benevolent? No, like
malevolent.
They call it like the avenging bride or something. I don't know.
That's the translation I saw that makes no
Weird.
sense to me. Or malevolent, not benevolent. I'm sorry, malevolent bride. Oh my God, it's just yes, the malevolent bride. So I think that what's happening there. So in the book, I write about this, like I give like fancy names to various ways in which global and local interacts, and so the most common way is something that I called conversion. It's when there is like 50-50, like global trope and local genre. And then Melissa points out that these two TV series have inversion. And I think that it's fascinating idea. I didn't think about it, but I think that they're like, it's not either or. I think it's still like kind of like combination. I think it does, like Judah definitely does a lot of conversion. And then it does produce like its own thing that we've never seen before, right? The whole original mythology of the Jewish vampire, but it's still rooted in the vampire lore, vampire trope. So just great stuff. And Jeremy, thank you so much for reminding us about these ideas of radical and conservative. I kept thinking about it this entire time because sometimes I wouldn't know if the film is radical or conservative. It's very hard to know, right? Is it just like a pressure valve that releases the tension and then we can go back to business as usual? Or does it introduce the actual kind of subversive ideas that pull the rug underneath the consensus? So, and it's always, yeah, and so I ultimately decided kind of not to prioritize that in the book because it's always so fraught. But yes, those are such important ideas. So thank you guys.
So I'm going to sign off as we come to the end and we haven't had any questions in by saying, go get the book. It's fabulous. I'm going to move my light so it doesn't like interfere, but it's a great book. It is so beautifully written, like such a pleasure to read, and such an easy read. The subject matter is hard, but the prose is amazing and smooth. And I'm so grateful for being invited to participate in this panel with some of my favorite people, and having an opportunity to talk about your work. So I want to thank you, Olga, and thank everyone who participated, Melissa, Jeremy, and Pablo, for making this such a rich evening. And to Eric, a shout out to Eric, who did all the tech for this and made everything work so smoothly today.
Okay.